that's good.
Okay, so can you see my screen?
I can, and it's beautiful.
Ah, excellent. All right, shall we go ahead and get started?
Yes, I think we should. If you would like to start by introducing yourself so I don't mispronounce your names, that would be wonderful.
Sure. So my name is Brandie Shatto. I am the program director of the educational technology programs at UMGC. And prior to my life in higher ed, I was a K-12 English teacher. So that's a little about me. Loyce, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I am Loyce Pailen, and I am the Senior Director of the Center for Security Studies here at UMGC. And we're responsible for all of the activities that relate to our designation as a Center for Academic Excellence, providing opportunities for student scholarships and teacher scholarships and that. So been working very closely with Diane and Brandie in the K-12 arena quite a bit lately. So I'm here for any questions.
Awesome. Yeah, Loyce and I are BFFs now. Okay, so essentially we're going to be talking about sustaining and engaging learning in a distance learning environment today. So some tips for if you're teaching virtually, as many districts are, or even if you're not, maybe not virtual, but still trying to interact with students in a remote learning type of environment. I'm going to talk a little bit about just how to rethink your face-to-face classroom in a more remote distance learning type of environment. And Loyce is going to give you some tips for how to stay safe online and how to encourage your students to stay safe as well. And of course, I don't know how many people we have with us on a Monday evening, but if you do have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or let us know, and we'll be happy to answer them. Okay, so I like to start with this image that I actually found in a blog post a few weeks ago when schools were really just starting to go online, and it's how to prepare for online teaching. And I think whether you're teaching online or you're teaching in some other distance learning type of environment, I think these 4 questions are really good for starting to frame your thinking. You know, when you're thinking about, okay, how do I take this environment where I'm in front of students every day to an environment where I'm maybe not in front of them every day, but I still need to help them learn. I think these 4 questions are really good for guiding you. So the first is thinking about how you're going to teach. There are really kind of 2 options, right? You can either teach synchronously. So do you have the capabilities to be able to meet with students in kind of a live environment, whether it's on Google Meet or Zoom or some other type of video platform? Or is most of the work going to be asynchronously, where students are working at their own pace? Or are you in a situation where maybe you can do a little of both? So it's starting to think about, you know, what knowledge and skills do you need to teach students, and what's the best way to do that? What can you know, if you have the opportunity to teach synchronously, what's the best or what information is best for those kind of live sessions, and what can you have students do in a more self-directed space? So I think that's kind of the first big question, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. The second is, how will students engage? And so that's really thinking about how you get them engaged with the content. I think in this type of situation where we're all kind of learning and working from home, a lot of that is going to be self-directed, but you can think about kind of what that might look like and other ways that you might get students to engage with each other or with you. If you are in a platform like Canvas, or you have some other type of LMS, you know, maybe that takes the form of discussions. If you're using Google Meet and your district or school allows you to, It's possible that you can have breakout rooms and do some sort of small group work, or maybe there are other activities via online resources or activities that you're having students do on their own. So it's thinking about like, what are some of those creative ways that you can get students to engage with content? And again, we're going to kind of dive into these questions a little bit more throughout the presentation. The third question that I think is key is, how will you communicate with students? We know that when we take learning out of the classroom, out of the kind of the four walls of the classroom, it can be a little isolating if it's not kind of set up to make sure that there's contact with students. So I think figuring out how you can communicate with students, whether that's, you know, through email, periodic emails, or if you have a platform that allows you to post announcements, just so that, you know, you're kind of helping to connect with students, or maybe you have a virtual meeting application like Google Meets, and you're going to have virtual office hours. It really can take a lot of different forms, but I do think it's key to kind of think about those communication platforms and how you can connect with students either synchronously or asynchronously. And lastly, how will you assess learning? That's a question I get a lot. How do I assess students when I can't see them, they're not here in front of me? We'll talk about a lot of different ways. This graphic is targeted at higher ed, so they have things on there about discussion forums and group work, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that. You know, you could create a Google form for students to kind of answer a few questions so you can see if they're on track. It might be looking at, you know, projects that they're working on, or having them submit, you know, even little formative checks. So there's a lot of different ways that you can assess learning. But I think in terms of the big picture, these four questions really kind of help you to start framing what that online learning space or that remote learning space might look like. And so kind of moving on from those four questions, when you start thinking about the content and the assessments, excuse me. When you start thinking about those content and assessments, it's really good to think about universal design for learning. And the whole premise behind UDL is that we use different parts of our brain for learning. The first are the recognition networks, which are really the what of learning, kind of how we gather information and categorize and store information. And so the way that that works in a remote learning environment is by providing multiple means of representation, or presenting the content to students in different ways. We all know that we have those students who, if you give them a chapter in a textbook to read, or you give them a news article or something like that, they're going to dig right through it and they're going to get everything they need out of it because they love to read, they're voracious readers, and they learn really well in that manner. But there are other students that that doesn't quite work for. And the beauty of online learning is that there are a lot of different ways that we can provide information to students. You know, you might find a video that does a really good job of explaining the content, or, you know, there might be a really good simulation online that the students can work through. So one of my recommendations is always to see what resources are out there and how you can present that information in different ways to students. The second piece of UDL is the strategic network, or the how of learning. That's really focused on how students demonstrate mastery of learning. And so the second UDL principle there is provide multiple means of action and expression. And that just means giving students some voice and choice about how they show you that they've mastered the content or mastered the skills that you're teaching, and giving them some choice in how you assess their learning. And the third is the effective network. So the first two really kind of deal with Bloom's kind of cognitive domain. The third one is the why of learning, or the affective domain. And that's really just thinking about how to get learners engaged and motivated, how to challenge them, how to get them excited. So providing them with multiple means of engagement. And again, just kind of different ways to experience learning, and thinking of ways to make it authentic and relevant to them. And I think one of the best kind of learning frameworks for applying UDL, and one that I think works especially well for the kind of circumstances that we find ourselves in, is project-based learning. And a lot of you have probably heard of project-based learning or may even implement it in the classroom. If you're not familiar with project-based learning, I think probably there's a lot of resources out there, but probably the most well-known is the Bucks Institute. They have what they call the gold standard for PBL, which has kind of 7 essential project design elements. It starts with a challenging problem or question. And so essentially what you do is you take a topic or unit of study and your learning objectives, and you frame it as a scenario or a challenge. I did this with a teacher in a research project that I was doing, and we focused on one of her marine biology classes. And the students were learning about coral reefs. So what we did was we took kind of her end of unit assessment and we turned it into a challenge. And we created this entire scenario where the students were applying for a grant with NOAA. And so they were going to get this big stipend, but they essentially had to present, a solution for stopping coral reefs from dying. And so that meant that they had to go out and explore different coral reefs, find out what was causing them to die or to decay. And they had to come up with some sort of creative solution for how they might stop the problem or repair the reefs. And so then they were doing some sustained inquiry, which is the second step there. So they were doing some research into coral reefs, finding out what makes a healthy coral reef, what happens when those different pieces aren't there, what are some potential ways that they can kind of solve this problem. And so they were doing a lot of kind of self-directed research. It was an authentic problem. We tried to frame it in sort of an authentic way to really kind of put them in the role of a marine biologist. They had voice and choice. So ultimately, we gave them a rubric with some requirements for what their presentation had to look like, but they could decide whether it was a video presentation or they were going to do a slide deck and how they were going to present it. And we had kind of checkpoints along the way, and they had some choice in those as well. So that's the student choice and voice piece. They had opportunities to meet with the teacher and reflect on their learning throughout the way. She would give them feedback so that they could revise their work. That was the critique and revision part. And then the public product was we actually brought in some people from marine biology departments, I think at universities, to view their presentations, because we know that when students, are turning in work to just their teachers, it's not, the quality isn't necessarily always as good as if they have to share that work with a larger audience. And so, sometimes that's not possible, but if there is a way to help students kind of present their work to a larger audience, I think that makes it even more relevant. So this is a great way to really kind of meet those principles of UDL, but also to frame learning in a way that is self-directed and that gets students kind of engaged and thinking about it in an authentic and kind of real world way. So that's kind of one thing. One question I get a lot when teachers are having to transition from kind of a classroom based learning environment to more of an online or remote learning is, how do I assess students? There are a lot of different ways. So obviously we talked about projects and how you can create kind of real world scenarios for students to work through. But you can also do things like choice boards, you know, just giving them a choice of how they demonstrate that they've learned the content, whether it's make a video or make an infographic, or, you know, maybe they have to write a song or something like that. But you can give them choices. If you are looking for a more traditional kind of assessment, there's things like Google Forms or Microsoft Forms where you can actually create quizzes and send them out to students and have them take the quiz or the test. That's a good way if you're looking for kind of a quick check. And if your county uses Google, and Microsoft may have other tools as well, I'm just not quite as familiar with them, but if you're a Google district, there are even add-ons that will grade the assessments for you. So that's a good choice. There are a lot of quiz tools online. You know, you could open up a Google Meet session and do a Kahoot with your class, or another quiz tool. I already mentioned kind of creative tools like infographics or posters. There's lots of great Web 2.0 tools to create those type of graphic representations. One of my favorite is Canva. And of course, students could create videos. I think one of the things that we can do during this time is take advantage of all these online resources that are out there and let students be creative. And I'll share this slide deck, but I have a link there to 75 digital tools and apps teachers can use to support formative assessment. That's a great list of just, you know, a whole bunch of different ideas for how you can assess students. And I know that there are some schools that have some restrictions in terms of like how many assignments can be graded per week. And there are some schools that maybe aren't grading things, but these can be used really just as a quick check to make sure that, you know, students are getting the information that they need and that they're learning. So it doesn't necessarily even have to be something that's graded. You might just be looking for a way to check in with them.
The link to the presentation I put in the chat, since you guys were so kind to give me the presentation ahead of time, if people want to
great,
get the links and the info.
Awesome. Okay, so that takes me to kind of my next point, which is I talked a little bit about how distance learning can feel isolating because you're kind of working through content on your own and you don't necessarily have the same kind of interactions that you might have in a face-to-face environment. And that's why feedback is so critical. That student to teacher communication piece, really important in especially in online learning. Just kind of checking in with students periodically and letting them know that they're doing okay is really important. It gives them, you know, when we talk about UDL and that affective domain, you know, that interaction is really important, that reinforcement. So we know as teachers that good feedback is frequent and balanced. You know, it's not all critical, it's not all positive, and that it's specific and meaningful, and that it's something that students can take action on. But I think one of the great things is that there are a lot of different tools that you can use to give feedback. Of course, you know, we can use things like email, or if you have a learning management system, you can give feedback, you know, through the grade book and those types of tools. But there are other kinds of ways that you can give feedback. If you have a video platform like Zoom or Google Meet, you can do virtual conferences, either one-on-one or, you know, maybe as a small group if students are all kind of at the same place working on the same things. So that's one way. You can do feedback through audio recordings, so it doesn't necessarily have to be live. There is an instructor in one of my programs, and in addition to his written feedback on an assignment, he'll usually record just a short little audio recording with just some feedback. Hey, you did these things really well. I think you need to work on these few points. And it just helps kind of contextualize that written feedback, because we all know that sometimes tone can get lost in writing, or the opposite can occur and people will interpret tone that you maybe didn't necessarily mean. So an audio recording can really kind of help clear those types of things up. Or one of my favorite things to do is a screen capture, which is one of my favorite tools is Screencast-O-Matic. And it's essentially just a tool that records your screen. So you can pull up an assignment and just sort of talk through it, and then you can send that video to the students. Now I know if you're a secondary teacher, you might have a lot of students and it might be difficult to do an individual recording for every single student. So you can do kind of whole class recordings too. There's another instructor in one of my programs that's really skilled at this. Each week, he'll kind of do a video of himself, and after the students have submitted their work and he's looked at it, he'll kind of, he'll write up some notes about what the entire class did really well and some of the interesting points from the week. And then he'll give some sort of concluding thought or feedback. And he does it as one video to the entire class. So there's a lot of different ways that you can give feedback to students to make those connections with them. And it doesn't have to take up, you know, hours and hours and hours of your day. So just something to think about. When we think about those multiple means of representation, I would encourage you to see what kind of online resources are out there. We call them open educational resources. I think when I first started teaching, I thought, you know, I had to create everything, and that it wasn't good if I didn't create it from scratch. But really there's so much stuff out there, you know, and a lot of it is really good. Some of it not so much, but you know, there's a lot of really good resources out there, videos, images, they're free textbooks online. Someone just sent me a free online textbook on learning theories, which was really good. Articles, tutorials, presentations. I've seen like simulations. I know there's a simulation online somewhere where you can like virtually dissect a frog. You know, there's so many good things out there, and there are links in the slide deck to some different places where you can go, and it'll give you, you know, just a list of places you can find open educational resources. When you are searching for resources online, do make sure you pay attention to the licensing. Look for those Creative Commons logos. You do want to be careful and make sure you're not abusing copyright. I have a list of them here, and I have some links to the Creative Commons websites where you can read about the different types of licenses and what you're allowed to do with things. It'll tell you, the license will tell you if you can use it for education but not commercially, or if you have permission to edit the resource, and then, you know, also whether or not you have to provide attributions. So this is a really good website. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on Creative Commons, but these are some good sites to check out. All right, moving right along. And I'm just sort of talking away. Do we have any questions or anything like that?
No questions lingering in the chat at the moment.
Okay.
We can pause for a sec and see if anybody pipes in. Good to
Yeah.
lecture, short and chunked. Here you are, modeling exactly what you're saying. I'm going to stop for a minute and chunk the lecture.
Right, right. Yeah. So just kind of rolling right through.
I do really like the idea of the teacher that has put the video on there that kind of speaks to the whole class and what was done well and what maybe needs some extra work. I think that's definitely valuable for, you know, like you're saying, keeping kids connected.
Yeah, yeah, he's really good at it. And it does, you know, it kind of gives him a way to have FaceTime, so to speak, but he's not necessarily having to record 30 different videos for every student in his class.
Yeah, it's brilliant. Yeah, that you add some details about, in this project, I saw it this way, and in this one, I saw it that way. And I mean, usually you have like a dozen that are all very similar and then a few outliers that you can call out.
Right.
As we started to move into this distance learning, I actually had my students walk through the process and create a screencast and turn it in for a grade. And I'll tell you, that has been a lifesaver, because when, for example, teaching code, they'll be able to go in, screencast, and then share their problem with other kids that can then support them along the way. So another good tip.
Awesome. Yeah, you actually stole a suggestion from a future slide, but that's okay.
Sorry.
No, that's great. Yeah, getting them involved and letting them be problem solvers as well. Yeah. So I have a few kind of suggestions up on the screen here for if you're going to hold virtual class meetings. I know and some school districts are doing this, others aren't. So if you have the ability to use a tool like Google Meet or Zoom, there are a lot of different ways. It doesn't necessarily have to be just a short, you don't have to spend lecture time, especially like if you're in block scheduling. Like I was speaking with some teachers at a school and they had block scheduling, and they had created a schedule where the students were going to be online for like an 80-minute period with each teacher. I would recommend that you not lecture for 80 minutes via Zoom. I don't know about anybody else, but my attention span for Zoom is getting shorter and shorter the longer that these stay-at-home orders exist. So if you're going to lecture, I'm not saying that you shouldn't, I would suggest that you keep it short and chunked, and maybe do a little bit of teaching and then give the students an activity to work on, then come back and do another short section. So you can do lecture, but you can also use a video conferencing tool for office hours. Just, you know, hey, I'm going to be online. I do this in my classes a lot. I'm going to be online every Wednesday night from 7 to 8. If you have questions about the class, feel free to pop in. You can do something like that. You can use it for one-on-one meetings to really kind of personalize instruction, or even small group meetings. But there are also some other creative ways that you can use them. You can bring in outside experts. So, you know, if there's somebody in your field that you have a connection with, you know, bring them into the classroom. Let them lecture at the kids for a while. Hopefully they're more accessible now that everyone is stuck at home. But you can also do virtual field trips. There are a lot of museums and kind of historical sites that are offering free virtual field trips for students who are learning at home. So, you know, you could explore one of those virtual field trips together via Zoom or Google or any of those tools. And if your district allows it, again, it kind of depends on what your requirements are. If you have the ability to assign breakout rooms, you can even still do small group work to kind of keep students connected with each other, depending on kind of their age and maturity level. But you know, it's an option. Okay, now my slides don't want to advance. There we go. Just some best practices. If you're going to use a video conferencing tool, make sure you set up the meeting in advance and you know, practice with it a little bit. Make sure you're familiar with the security features. Loyce is going to talk a little bit about cyber safety and Zoom bombing and all of those types of things. So I would say get used to the tool, set up your meeting in advance, make sure you understand the security features. Then just like you would plan out your face-to-face instruction with a lesson plan, plan your meeting. Kind of have a general structure. You may not stick to it exactly, but if you have kind of a guidelines in mind, that'll help your meeting go a little more smoothly. Make sure you communicate to students kind of when you're meeting and where and all the details that they need, so there's not a lot of chaos in the beginning. And then of course you're going to kind of implement the meeting. My colleague Brandie says if it's the first time you're having one of these meetings, let students play with all the filters and tools and get it out of their system, and then kind of move into your instruction. And of course, after the meeting, follow up. If you're able to record it, send out the recording. Or, you know, if there are students that couldn't attend for some reason, you can always send out, you know, a little email or post an announcement with kind of the major points. But really planning these video conferences, no different than planning kind of your face-to-face instruction. Just have a little lesson plan in mind. Okay, I didn't put any resources on here for Zoom because I think that some schools, if not all the schools, are not using Zoom right now. I'm not entirely sure, but it seems like a lot of districts are using Google Meet. So I put a few links on here. The first one is specifically for teachers. The second link is focused more toward business, but I think it has some good points. You just kind of have to make the translation from business to the classroom. And I'm going to stop talking at you for a little bit and let Loyce talk.
Just have to find the old mute button. I have two computers going, so I had the mouse for the wrong computer on this one. But anyway, well, thank you so much, Brandie. The only thing I had to add to that is that in looking at some of the online classes for people, for my grandkids and friends and other teachers that I've talked to, it seems like the classrooms are fairly unorganized. So one, you know, well, maybe in the higher level classes where a student may have 2 or 3 or 4 different teachers who are using different tools, the classes can be set up so differently that it takes a minute or 2 of precious time to figure out what the instructor has done to organize the class. And just a general example is, you know, if you go in discussions, some teachers will have the discussions in ascending order and then for date. And if you go into the next class, they're in descending order. And it's something simple like that, that if a student has several different teachers setting up their classrooms differently, or even using different tools. They may not use different tools. They may have standards that they have to use, but just different ways of using the online environment. It can be a little bit confusing for students. That's what I've seen. Have you seen any of that?
Yeah, actually, even at the graduate level, I get students who in course evaluations will say, why is every class set up differently? So I think it's just good practice if you're able to collaborate with, you know, other teachers to try to come up with a consistent kind of organizational pattern.
Right. So moving on to the cybersecurity concerns, just a little background. UMBC held a Gen Cyber teacher camp last July, which seems like years ago for some reason. But it was just last July. We had 25 teachers from around the state of Maryland come to our campus, and we did a week-long cybersecurity camp that gave them a whole host of tools and technologies and lesson plans and labs and things for them to take back to their classrooms and to try to incorporate some of that content into their classrooms. And it just so happened maybe about a week, 3 weeks ago, we had a reunion meeting of the Gen Cyber teachers, and out of the 25, I think 20 of them attended, and had a really good conversation, but basically about how successful or unsuccessful have you been in implementing your cybersecurity content labs, curriculum, lesson plans in your classrooms. And we had a variety of feedback. Some are moving right along, some have technology issues, some have issues with administration allowing them to do certain things. So there was a whole host of issues and successes that the teachers brought back. But one of the things that we also did ask them, since we're in this new phase of learning, to talk a little bit about the cybersecurity concerns that they see teaching in an online environment. And they gave us quite a bit of feedback, and I've kind of summarized it here. So Brandie talked a little bit about whether you're going to, whether teachers are using Google Meet or Zoom. And I'm not sure if it makes any difference, as long as once again, there's some consistency in what the students are seeing. But from a cybersecurity standpoint, many of the teachers were concerned about privacy as usual. Are any of these systems, Google Meet, Zoom, or anything else that anybody is using, is that collecting information about students in the background that we don't know about? And that was kind of a big concern, that this information might be collected. Students, I'm not sure how all of the systems work from a student standpoint, but if they have to sign on and give information, of course, the companies are collecting their information, and that is a no-no. They were concerned about young children being on video chat systems. I think you kind of talked about, I think the example that Brandie gave, that Randy said about letting them play with it for a few minutes before you try to do anything serious, was a great idea. But you have to be careful with with young children and what people are doing on these video chat systems and what they're saying in the online chat. So those were some concerns of the teachers. They also felt that they needed to protect themselves. These educators were concerned that in this new online environment, not only with the tools and technologies, but with grading and assessing and things like that, they needed to be kind of protected, and what were the legal issues that they might be concerned about. I think everybody heard about Zoom bombing, where hackers were taking advantage of the security flaws, and the threat actors were getting access to the webcams in Zoom. So of course, that's something that we in cybersecurity hear about and talk about every day. The threat of hackers taking advantage of security flaws and apps and in your mobile phone and other things. And we've heard a lot even before now, that they can take advantage of personal cameras. Of course, we need to have physical security. Some of these things were just kind of the general cybersecurity concerns that one must have being online, physical security and of computers, and making sure that you were working on a virtual private network where possible. I thought this one was interesting, where the teachers felt that there needed to be an increase in the staff to help them with tech support. So in our university environment, with our labs, we have been through the process of trying to understand how to support students with virtual labs and virtualization and things like that. You do have to have a substantial amount of tech support in order to support not only the faculty, but the students also. So I think they started to see a need that the teachers had to become troubleshooters for the technology for some of the students because there just wasn't enough tech support staff at the schools and the districts. Going back to, I just kind of talked about this a little bit with the physical security and VPN, we had to have some type of opportunity to teach the fundamentals of cybersecurity to the students prior to them getting into these online environments. We have to make sure that they have caught up on cyber safety. All teachers, not just computer science teachers, all teachers need to be able to teach the basics of cyber safety. And that's kind of the importance of strong passwords and all of the social engineering problems that could happen, how to avoid phishing, scams, things like that. It was just, some teachers know about that, and some teachers can start off some of their online sessions giving that brief cyber safety review, but some of them had not had that, didn't have that information available to them, or weren't aware that they should do it. So of course, that always leads to a little bit more professional development that's needed for the teachers. Let me stop there for a minute. Any questions about that? No?
The only thing that I would add to that, and I don't know if this has been something that's had a lot of conversation, I know that Zoom has had its own issues, but we just had some information be disseminated from our county as well about using Google Meet, especially for students, that when you utilize that platform, you have to actually name the meeting, because if you don't name the meeting, the link to it stays live forever, and kids are getting on after the meeting is over and having inappropriate conversations. So it's those little nuances that you don't know are a problem that are still a problem.
Feels like we need a clearinghouse for this as we discover the things to know about each one that's just a little fluky thing that we need to be able to pass them on to each other quickly. Did you know?
Right.
That's right. The next bullet point is the digital divide. And I was telling somebody on one webinar when they brought up the whole digital divide, where there are students who don't have the available technology, they don't have Wi-Fi at home. There's a whole, when I started my dissertation 20 years ago, I was going to write it on the digital divide. And I didn't do that, but I just brought that up because that's been a problem for a long time. And it pains me to realize that we're still in 2020 still talking about a digital divide. And it's unbelievable that there's so many students who didn't have the technology or the Wi-Fi at home. Or if they did, there were so many people using it that they didn't have the opportunity to do what they needed to do. It just boggles my mind that that is still an issue this late in the game. Another thing that we talked about, UMGC has a virtual environment called NetLabs, and it allows users to set up pods, which is just a time period where they can use various labs in a virtual environment. And there are some pre-made labs, and there are pods where an instructor could create their own lab. So we talked a little bit more about those contained environments are much nicer than having to deal with something that is not so contained, because that while there might be cybersecurity issues, they're very limited in a virtual or contained environment like that. So we would like to see more use of that in the school system. And the last one was just the need for standards and guidelines from NIST. So NIST and the National Institute for Cybersecurity Education, the NICE group, have lots of things that are available. As a matter of fact, when I was thinking about this presentation, and I was working on a couple of other projects with the NICE K-12 group, there's a whole host of information out there. I mean, there is a lot of, one tends to think of Khan Academy, for curriculum for students, but there is so much stuff out there. And I'm working with some of the folks in the NICE K-12 technical working group to start categorizing and formalizing a directory for some of that information. It's a great thing, but once again, it's just, to me, it just seems like we should be past some of these things that we're trying to do now. I had one more slide. Let me see if I can share a slide with you. Do we have time?
I'll stop sharing for a second so that you can share. While you're looking for that, I think it's interesting. Before Zoom bombing became a major news story, UMGC got Zoom bombed. They were having a Zoom meeting over in our overseas division in Asia, and a meeting was Zoom bombed.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So just one more thing, because like I said, we planned this discussion a week or so ago. And every time I hear something that's happening, I just think it's just amazing that we as a country and school districts and state governments are just kind of learning as we go along. So I thought it was just very interesting that the Maryland State Department of Education has waived student service learning hours, which I thought was kind of interesting. I'm bringing that up because I have a mentee that I work with who had not done her service hours, and looks like she's going to get off the hook now, which I think is kind of interesting. But once again, this kind of goes to us kind of not being too prepared about things. I did see something about distance learning at the Prince George's County Public Schools, that they were bringing affordable high-speed internet to some of the households. Once again, going back to the digital divide, I'm just surprised that this just kind of came out a few days ago that this was happening. And then the latest one, I don't know if you heard about, was the Fairfax County Public Schools, where I think they just totally stopped their distance learning for a while. Did you hear about that?
Yep, that's kind of amazing. They're one of the best educated school districts in the world. And they just didn't quite think it through, and boy, things happened. So yeah, they should just shut it right back down.
I have heard that.
I have a question about distance learning being digital divide versus privilege divide.
No.
Because I don't know that every household in America has internet availability. So is it a privilege or is it a digital divide?
Well, I have my own personal opinion about it, is that, and it's a little different now than the way I thought about it 20 years ago. It seems like everybody has a mobile phone now. I mean, even some of the homes that do not have lots of money, people who are not below the poverty level, but around there, many of them have cell phones. So I'm not sure why efforts haven't been made to incorporate that into people having access to Wi-Fi and to the tools and utilities that they need in a learning environment. Once again, my own personal opinion, and every time I talk about it, I get mad about it, is that I feel that we've been having snow days for a long time. And I can't understand why a snow day has been an off day for so long, when a snow day could have been building up to the times that we need now, the features that we have now. If we had taken snow days more seriously as learning opportunities, we would have been better prepared for this. This is just not, the fact that students needed to learn at home did not just creep up on us.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I don't know if it's privilege or a digital divide.
Both. I mean, I think there are instances you know, where income is a factor, but I know in the school district where I used to teach, which is in rural Pennsylvania, even families who had money sometimes lived in an area where there was no high-speed internet or cell service because they were at the bottom of the mountain or something. So, you know, I think it depends, but I really think it's both. In some cases, you know, families just don't have the devices or the internet connection, and I think in other areas it's an income kind of disadvantage, I guess you could say. I don't know if that's the best way to phrase it, but
even when when I was studying the digital divide issues, always about privilege. It did have to do with, you know, people being in rural areas
yeah.
where they just absolutely couldn't get it. So it had a little touch of both.
It would almost seem to me that at this point in time that these internet companies would have some kind of a interface system available that they could reach these more remote areas more systematically, because that certainly does contribute to the divide. I know in our particular school, we have probably 45 students that are not able to access internet on any kind of regular basis, and now they're getting paper packets of material that they have to take pictures of and email them back to the teachers, and it's a real struggle.
Yeah. Yeah, even today, my parents, in order to get cell service at their house, have to have, like, they have a special range